A journalist workshop, multiple myeloma media workshop, path to a cure. So I'd first of all like to welcome you here in the audience here in New Orleans at the time of the ASH meeting, the annual ASH meeting. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are watching us online from a cloud somewhere. Hopefully you have a chance to look at our panel. We are very, very privileged to have a stellar guest panel here to my left, Dr. Joseph Terraman, Dr. Joe Mikhael, and all the way from Salamanca in Spain, Dr. María-V. Mateos. And I've been told not to read the slides, as you just heard, but you can see that we will have some very, very special guests as we move through the evening. So just to introduce what we're going to be talking about, I know that a number of the journalists here in the audience are learning about myeloma for the first time, or maybe with some limited background knowledge. So what is myeloma? Well, from the perspective of me and our panel members, it's a very important cancer, very important. This is what we spend our lives working on. But for those of you who may never have heard about it, it's a cancer of the bone marrow, a cancer of the immune cells in the bone marrow, the plasma cells, the cells that normally make antibodies to fight infection. In myeloma, they turn cancerous. The things that they do when they turn cancerous is that they create factors that destroy the bone around the bone marrow. And so this is what is a big problem for patients with myeloma. They have damage to the bone, they have fractures of the bone, so they have a lot of pain in the bone potentially. And so this is the diagnostic feature of myeloma. You have a problem with protein in the blood which is coming from the myeloma cells, and you have problems with the bone. In addition, there is a problem with the immune system because these cells develop because the immune system is abnormal. And so the plasma cells are growing and the normal immune system is suppressed. And so there's a susceptibility to infection and other problems because the immune system is low. Myeloma is also important because it's increasing in incidence. There are more patients around the world being diagnosed with myeloma, and for some reason it's being diagnosed in patients who are younger. The average age for a patient with myeloma is in the mid-60s, but now we are seeing patients who are younger and younger. Recently and ongoing, there is a patient in Brazil diagnosed in myeloma at the age of 8 years old. And so we realize that we need to be cautious no matter the age of the patient. There is tremendous interest in myeloma at the scientific level, and the reason for that is what you're going to hear about tonight. So at ASH this year, this big meeting here in New Orleans, there are 830 abstracts about myeloma. Fashion. How long should we use them? How much should we give? There are different combinations that may be the best, and we need to look at all of this kind of information. So from the different speakers, you're going to have different information about these different aspects. Dr. Joe Mikhael, for example, will be talking about some of the key points, the new information that we hear right here at the ASH meeting. there is a very, very exciting aspect of treatment, which is if we start treatment earlier, there is an early form of myeloma, what we call smoldering myeloma. Before it turns really active, there's an early form of the disease. And in a really pioneering way, the team from Salamanca in Spain, led by Dr. Mateos, have looked at what happens if you start treatment early. Will this really produce better results? And depending on what kind of treatment you use, maybe we could even have a chance to cure patients if we start treatment at a very early time point. And this is something that I'll talk about because this is a key objective of the Black Swan projects. You'll notice in the bottom corner of the slide there's a black swan, and I'll be talking about what that might mean later. So as we start the program, I would like to bring up, to make a few comments, two representatives from key foundations. I'd like to welcome up Susie Novas, the president of the International Myeloma Foundation, and Aldo Del Cal, chief scientific advisor and co-founder of Myeloma Canada. So if you wouldn't mind both coming up together, and Susie, if you'd like to say a few words.
I do.
I know this is true.
And I'm happy to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Aldo. So good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the journalists and the support group leaders who are joining us here tonight in New Orleans and people who are here from more than a dozen countries, which is really a big deal. Patients, reporters watching on the internet. I'd also like to welcome those of you who have tuned in expecting to see the last episode of Homeland. Unfortunately, it's not the last episode of Homeland, but it's far more important. Every year, we are excited about the treatment advances, giving many of our patients increasingly longer remissions with the opportunity to lead active lives. This year, the progress continues with new drugs, earlier treatments, and emerging combinations. But this year, we are also working towards finding a cure for multiple myeloma, as you just learned, from the IMF's Black Swan Research Initiative. We publicly unveiled it this past March. This is not a generic war on cancer. Instead, leading scientists from our research arm, the International Myeloma Working Group, are calibrating the equipment to actually look inside the myeloma cell to measure what happens on a molecular and also on a genetic level, and then to devise a very creative way to stop it. The Black Swan Research Initiative team began their stay here in New Orleans with a meeting to review progress that's already happened and plan the next steps. And Dr. Durie will obviously bring us up to date on the latest science. But no treatment and no advance is meaningful unless it reaches you, the patients. There's a wide global disparity about access to treatments. And one of the ways to combat this is to make sure that patients, families, and government officials around the world know how much today's treatments can accomplish. That's one of the missions of this workshop, to let everyone know that these are not just baby steps in myeloma. The progress is actually life-changing, and the lives that can be changed are those of all of our patients. And to say a little more on this, let me introduce my dear friend and co-sponsor of Myeloma Canada, Aldo Del Cal.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much. In Canada, we know how important it is to get new drugs, not just medically approved, but reimbursed by the provincial and territorial funding authorities. Access to drugs through our public healthcare system can vary widely depending on wherever you live. And that's simply not right. Access to drugs, especially life-extending drugs, should be a medical decision and should not be dependent on your postal code. At Myeloma Canada, we do groundbreaking work to make sure this patient voice is heard by the decision makers. We do so through formal submissions to the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, which is Canada's health technology assessment organization. And we make the patient voice heard through programs like this and other public outreach, meetings, and campaigns. At Myeloma Canada, we are presently preparing a patient submission to the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review in support of public funding for Panelists, which is a new drug currently under review by Health Canada, and we expect to have regulatory approval for this drug in 2014. The funding decisions are supposed to be made on the basis of medical evidence. Together, let's make sure that doctors, patients, and regulatory authorities hear about all the compelling evidence that's being presented this week here at ASH. Thank you. Brian?
So thank you so much, Susie and Aldo, for giving some perspective about the environment in which we introduce these new treatments and the benefits that can come from that. So what are the benefits that come from these newer therapies? There are very important novel agents that you're going to hear about, and they really are starting to make an impact. And so in the last decade, we have seen the introduction of novel agents which are well tolerated and really have a powerful impact on the response and the remissions and the survival for patients with myeloma. And so on this diagram that you see here, we've gone from a situation where we had very limited drugs that worked a little bit but really didn't extend survival too much, to a benefit that was achieved using high doses of the drugs, using high doses of a drug called melphalan, which is called an alkylating agent, and doing stem cell or bone marrow transplant. This clearly improved the outcome for patients with myeloma in the decade before 2000. And so in the 1980s and the 1990s, we did see significant improvement in survival with the introduction of high-dose therapy and stem cell transplant. But based on information coming from Dr. Mikhael's colleague, Dr. Shaji Kumar at the Mayo Clinic, he summarized, well, what is the impact since the novel therapies have been used in the past 5 to 10 years. And so what Shaji did was he looked at the outcomes between 2001 and 2005, and then the next 5 years, 2006 to 2010, and he has actually an update since then. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is in these 5-year time intervals, there has been significant improvement. And you can see what has been most encouraging for myeloma patients, for whom the average age is up in the 60s, is that in the elderly patients, in the patients over the age of 65, and so at the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that between those two 5-year time periods, the survival, the 5-year survival, went from 31% to 56%. So over half of these patients are now surviving for longer than 5 years. And you can see in the younger patients, 73% of these patients are living longer than 5 years. So these are very, very important numbers showing that a majority of patients are really having improvement in their outcomes. And so to demonstrate what we're experiencing with these novel agents, there's nothing like meeting someone who has actually been using and taking these drugs. And so at this point, I'd like you to meet Hardy Jones. If we can play the video right now, please.
In the late 1970s, I found a school of friendly dolphins in the Bahamas. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. The experience changed my life. 25 years later, I was diagnosed with a disease that intertwined my life with dolphins. In 2003, I was shocked when a routine blood test led to my being diagnosed with a form of blood cancer called multiple myeloma.
I wasn't sure I was looking at the video, then I realized I was looking at myself right now. So So Hardy, obviously there are several things that come to mind. Someone like yourself who was really active, diving with a heavy camera, studying dolphins, and then suddenly, out of left field, someone says, we've done these tests and we think you have this thing called myeloma that you've never heard of. I mean, this is a horrible thing. What was your first thinking at this point?
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
And then it went on. My doctor, who was a very competent guy, said, look, calm down. We've got stuff for you. And the stuff was thalidomide. And I went on it, and I got about a 97% reduction in my protein and in my free light numbers, and the whole spectrum of numbers was reduced by 95, 97%. So I was able to, well, congruent with that, I had just been given a contract by PBS to do a film that involved me filming dolphins and whales all around the world. So it was like, you got myeloma, now you've got to go out and do this.
Right,
This
and
project.
so this thalidomide was a capsule,
It was
and
a
so
capsule.
you were taking it every day.
And I could take it to Norway or Tahiti or any place and just do my regimen and maintain that remission that is now past 10 years.
Yes, diagnosed, as you can see on the screen there, 2003. And so since then, the additional thing that's happened in the last decade is that you took thalidomide for a number of years, 6, 7 years, but then it wasn't working so well.
No, it worked fine. I never had a drop while I was on the thalidomide.
Okay,
What happened was that a doctor suggested that I take a vacation from it.
Aha.
So I went off for 16 months, and very slowly, my numbers came up to a point where I was unwilling to see them progress any further. So a doctor at Mayo Clinic put me on Revlimid.
I see. So this is the next generation, the drug after thalidomide, Revlimid. And so then you did well on the Revlimid.
In ever decreasing doses down to, I forget what it was, but it was 10 milligrams.
Yeah,
I
probably
can't
10
remember
or
the
maybe
figures, 10
5.
10
or
milligrams.
5, yes.
And then very low doses of Dex.
All right, and then this last year, just in the spring, I think, or even earlier, early part of this year, January, February, what happened then?
Well, I was then taken off of the Revlimid for 16 months.
Okay,
And that I stayed stable for quite a long time, and then the numbers began to creep up. And I had a situation with a doctor who said, you still don't need to get treatment. These numbers are still quite low. But there was some bone involvement in the scapula, and I said, I don't like that a bit. So I actually, he was quite insistent that I didn't need treatment, and I said, well, I'm going to call Dr. Durie. So I picked up my phone.
Which is a risky thing, but
The name of a new show we're going to do.
yes.
So I called Dr. Durie, and I said, Brian, this is Hardy. Do you have a second? He said, well, I just got off a plane. I'm in Barcelona. But he continued to talk to me. I said, does this make sense to you? Bone involvement, no treatment. He said, get on treatment immediately. So armed with that backup, I went back to the Mayo Clinic and I said, doctor, the question is what treatment we start, not if. So he then put me on Velcade, sub-Q Velcade, which I ran till I got my numbers plateaued out. And now I get the injection every other week
Right,
with a little bit of Dex.
right.
And that has been marvelous. I really don't think it's giving me any side effects whatsoever.
Right. So I think that this is just to illustrate, you can see the impact on someone with an active life. He's gone through 3 of these novel agents, never had a stem cell transplant. So in this case, novel agents 1, 2, 3, and here you are today. So it's wonderful to see. So thank you
Thank
for
you,
telling
Rob.
us a story.
Thank you very much. Great to see you.
So where do we go from here? Well, we need to refine these treatments. We've got new treatments coming that you'll hear about from Joe Mikhael, presented at ASH this year, but there are refinements to these novel agents that we have, and the refinements come from longer experience. What is the longer-term outcome? And so one abstract presented at the plenary session today at ASH this afternoon at 2:45 was a study which compared different combinations of novel agents. And in this study, there were a very large number of patients, over 1,600 patients, so a huge study. And so what you realize here is that it's not trivial to find out if one treatment is better than another. You need a lot of drugs and a lot of time and a lot of careful analysis to look at this. And so this was a study in patients over the age of 65, which is the majority of patients with myeloma, and it looked at a 2-drug combination versus a 3-drug combination. And so obviously this has implications both in terms of toxicity and expense. And so a very, very important abstract that was picked for the plenary session at ASH this afternoon and was presented by a doctor from France, Dr. Thierry Faucon, who did a very good job. And so this abstract showed 3 arms. It had arm A, which was Revlimid and Dex, so this was the drug that you just heard that Hardy took for some time, and it compared it, if you take it all the time, all the way until the myeloma actually progresses, versus if you take it a limited amount of time for a year and a half and see what happens when you stop it, versus an older combination, which is a combination of the older drugs, melphalan and prednisone, with thalidomide added in, which is actually the first drug that Hardy took. And the outcome of the study was very clear, that the 2-drug combination of Revlimid plus dexamethasone was superior to the 3-drug combination of melphalan, prednisone, and thalidomide. And so this is extremely important because right now, the 3-drug combination is actually the approved regimen, particularly in Europe by the EMEA. This is the approved frontline regimen. So here we have a study that shows that a 2-drug regimen is giving better results. The results were better in terms of what's called progression. The length of the remission was longer by a factor of 28%, and the survival was better by a measure of 22%. There was also an advantage, a statistical advantage, in the patients who stayed on the continuous therapy versus those who stopped after 18 months. And so we can see here that there was a reduced risk of death, and clearly the key thing right now, not to be too harsh about it, is that clearly we have new drugs coming, is to keep patients alive, get the best response that we can right now, which is great in itself, but they're alive and can take benefit, just as Hardy did, from that next drug coming down the pike. And so there has been a particular interest in, do you really need to stay on maintenance or not? I mean, do you need to take it for 18 months? Maybe if you take it 2 years, that's good, or maybe 3 years. And so there was a detailed study from the Mayo Clinic, also by Dr. Mikhael's colleagues, looking at studies in the setting of maintenance after having a stem cell transplant. And basically, in this analysis, there was evidence that across the board, the maintenance therapy was providing benefit in terms of the remission and the survival. Now, there are some pros and cons to this, and Joe may choose to discuss this a little bit later, but at least we're seeing some evidence on the right-hand side of the slide here in an individual study, which is a US study, where the maintenance provided longer remissions and improved survival. And so we thought it would be very interesting for you to see and to meet a patient who has been on Revlimid maintenance currently for 8 years. And so, Michael, I was thinking you would be in the front, but there you are. So I'd like you to meet Michael Durie. Welcome, Michael.
Durie. Thank you.
If you come over to my right-hand side here. So let me just take through what people are looking at on the screen here.
Okay.
So you were diagnosed in 2000, 13 years ago. He's been on Revlimid for the last 8 years. Now, what we're going to talk about for a moment is that in addition to having myeloma, Michael has a very serious medical problem, which is that he's allergic to antibiotics. So what that means is if he goes through aggressive treatment and he can't take the antibiotics, he would not be able to fight off infection. And so in his case, it's particularly important that he doesn't relapse. So what it says on the slide here, needs to avoid relapse. That's because of this particular problem. And so when you were faced with this medical situation, let's just take you through it. He has this medical allergy to antibiotics. As you can see, how old were you when you were diagnosed here? It doesn't
I was
say.
36.
36 years
So,
old.
I'm 49 now.
Right. And his wife is sitting right back there. And you can see that he has 2 children there. Ali is sitting with him as he's playing the guitar there. And then Mikey, his son, is playing ball with him in the back garden there. So married with a young family and definitely wanting to stay alive.
Of course, definitely.
And so the situation for Michael was that you had gone through a transplant and he had a PET scan after the transplant that showed that he had a negative PET scan. So he was not on any maintenance. But so what happened at that point? You were following along, no maintenance.
Yeah, I was doing well, and after my stem cell transplant, I had a 3-year remission, which is wonderful, with 0 maintenance. So it was actually a very good time in my life without taking any kind of medication. But something happened, my body changed, and I turned into a non-secretor, and I started breaking ribs. I'd sneeze, I'd break a rib. I broke 4 ribs within a span of 2 weeks. So we decided it was time to do something. And it came down to either a stem cell transplant or a drug Revlimid that was just an the expanded access trial. So this man here, fortunately, directed me in the right direction. And
Well, obviously I didn't know if it was going to work well, but I did know it was going to be a problem for him to go through another stem cell transplant because he had truthfully barely survived the first
yeah,
one.
that's true. I had 106 fever. When you have a transplant and you get a very minor fever, they cover you with antibiotics to protect you. But when they did that, my fever went up to 106. So I was 106 for 5 days, and before they finally eliminated everything. So it was not my choice in the future to have a stem cell transplant, only because of my situation.
And so he went on to Revlimid, and really a couple of really important parts about that is that since then, how would you describe your life on the Revlimid?
3 months, I was in complete stringent remission, and life's been wonderful. Fantastic.
And so the final question, which relates to, we look at data and say, well, should patients stay on maintenance? For you, is there a question?
It's not even a question. I've had 8 years of being with my family, enjoying my family. I've been healthy. I have issues with my back from the disease. When I was diagnosed, I've had back problems, but
Right.
Revlimid is a godsend for me, and I am grateful for it, no
Right.
doubt.
So you need to look at these on an individual basis, but you can see these are life-saving drugs. They're family and individual saving drugs. And so thanks for telling your story.
Thanks, Dr. Durie.
So another aspect of taking therapy is that we know that you can maintain the disease, but also we're seeing data at this meeting that if you get a certain amount of drug, that it may be just enough to knock the myeloma enough to get an added benefit. And so we do see that, for example, at this meeting, using another novel agent, Velcade, In this particular study, patients would take Velcade along with melphalan or not, but what is being presented actually by María-Victoria's colleague from Spain is that if you take a certain dose, in this case above 39 milligrams per meter squared, the amount that you take over a period of time allows you to do better, and this shows you the survival benefit by able to stay on the drug and get that amount of drug to really get that added impact. And you can see this is not trivial. You can have an improved survival of 10 months to a year. And so these are some issues to give you a flavor of what we're dealing with. We're very, very pleased to have these novel agents, but we need to learn how to do the best job for the patient, how to get the best results, but also to tailor the therapy to manage the disease and to manage the side effects. And so I'm particularly pleased to have Joseph Terman with us tonight to take you through this individual impact of these drugs on patients. So please welcome Joseph Terman.
Thank you, and welcome again. So, during my doctoral dissertation, I've looked at patient's perspective and physician's perspective, and what I'd like to emphasize tonight is the patient's perspective because it's very important. What we know in multiple myeloma is that once the patient is symptomatic, there's a treatment that needs to be done. However, if you look at the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines on treatment, there are so many options for patients newly diagnosed with symptomatic myeloma. And so the question is, how do we choose and what are the factors that the patient brings into the table when it comes to decision making? What we know is that there's no single best therapy for a patient. There's a lot of clinical trials that needs to be done. There's a lot of questions that needs to be answered. But then what we now have is that we have so many choices for patients newly diagnosed with symptomatic myeloma. So I examined the patient and I tried to find out what were the factors that this patient consider when they made that decision of what treatment they're going to take. What we learned from my study was that patient knows that there are many, many treatment options. Number one also is that they know that if they could just stay on treatment, there's going to be medical advances in the future, that there is hope. They're very hopeful that the science will continue to improve and that it's going to make them live longer. However, they're very smart as well. They also know that they need to use what they have now. They can't just rely on what's in the future, but they need to use what they have now to bridge that, to make it to the future. So it's very important for the patient to really understand what do I have now so that I can move on with my life and can live longer later. So when I asked the patient, I interviewed 20 patients, I recorded them and I reviewed them many, many times. And what we found out in the theme is that patients really look at quality of life. These are older patients. These are over 65 years old that I interviewed. And what we learned from them was that they really look at quality of life issues. Therefore, if you look at quality of life issue studies, it's important that the side effects of the drug should not be horrendous because there's a very strong link of quality of life and side effects of the drug. The second thing that the patient considered was they asked their doctor, well, will it make me cancer-free? Will this drug make me live longer? That's the second that they were looking. And then the third one, of course, is convenience. I have to say that in patients who are really older, the 75 years old, and I have one 84-year-old patient, hands down, the 80-something-year-old patients, they would tell you, I prefer oral drugs because I don't have to go to the clinic. And for an 80 years old, that's a no-brainer. It was hands down their choice of treatment. So 3 things that I'd like to emphasize that the patient really consider when they make a choice and when they voice out their preference to their doctor. Number 1, they want their doctor to pay attention to their quality of life, therefore side effect must be managed. Number 2, they want a drug that's going to make them live longer. And number 3, they really want convenience at the same time, especially the older adults. What we also learned is that 75 of the patients that we surveyed really look at the physician as their source of information. it's so important that the physician devote a lot of time in educating the patient, because the physician is the main source of information. And then internet. The internet is now the second most common source of information to the patient. And that's thanks to our International Myeloma Foundation, our organizations, myeloma.org. They have everything that the patient needs, one stop. You want it online, you want it on print, you can call the hotline, they'll send you all the information that you need, because it is so critical that our internet get the proper and the correct information out there, because sometimes wrong information gets into the hands of the patient and they will not get the correct information to guide them with their decision. So, moving on, I have to ask one of our guests from Israel, and to give you some perspective on some of the global disparities that's happening in the myeloma world, and I'm going to call the CEO of IMiD from Israel, Varda. Please welcome her. So, Varda, I'd like you to share with us about some of the challenges I've heard we talked about 5 minutes ago, the challenges that you faced in Israel. Can you share to me what are the key strategies that you have done in order to get Revlimid into the approval process in Israel?
Okay, it took us about 2 years to get the Revlimid into the health basket in Israel. We started in 2008, and we got usually the committee, they are sitting between November, December, about the inclusion of new drugs, and we got a negative answer. And my main message here is don't give up. You have to fight to include the new drugs into the health basket. So what we did, we took one of the leading law office in Israel that is dealing with human rights, and they volunteered, and we went to Supreme Court, and we entered the Supreme Court with about 100 patients with tags, red tags, that it was written that I'm a myeloma patient and we need 500,000 shekels for the treatment. It made a big impression, and they asked us to take out the tags, and they let all the hematologists, by the way, of Israel were in the Supreme Court. They supported us, and they came to the Supreme Court, and they let one of the leading hematologists to speak, and in the end of the day, after an hour, they decided to deny it. So we didn't give up. We started to protest in front of government office. We took 200 patients with their families. It was led by our president, which is Ada Yonat. She's a Nobel Prize. So she was the leading of the protest. And we had a lot of journalists that helped us in Israel. In the end of the day, in the beginning of 2010, it was approved.
Wow.
So
I'm out of words on the difficulties that they have to really surmount in order to get a drug. So I think that you are here, you're the journalist. When you go back to your country, make sure that your government will have increased awareness on how important this drug, because you've seen a lot of testimonies from our patients. It really makes them live longer and their quality of life is better. Thank you.
okay.
So thank you so much both for that strong message of how advocacy at the patient level can really, really have an impact. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Dr. Joseph Mikhael from the Mayo Clinic based in Scottsdale, who is very impassioned about myeloma, and we're very, very pleased that Joe can be here with us tonight to take us through some of the highlights from ASH. So please welcome Dr. Joe Mikhael.
Thanks. Thank you, Brian. Tremendous privilege to be here, always with you, to enjoy time at the IMF and to think a little bit together about what's been going on at this meeting. I suspect that many of you are familiar with this meeting, but you know, as a myeloma community, and we've really developed a very tight international myeloma community, we recognize that although we meet several times over the course of the year, and although there are many venues in which our research is presented, it's quite likely that it is definite that this meeting, the annual meeting of the American Society of Hematology, really leads all other meetings as to the depth of the research that's presented. Now, I'm very familiar with the fact that some of you are experts, if you will, in multiple myeloma. Others of you couldn't spell myeloma before you came in the room. So we recognize that there's a huge difference in experience here, but nonetheless, what we'd like to do is take a few minutes to think with you and show to you some of what we've been hearing about that has been happening in that history and the timeline of multiple myeloma. A couple of sort of critical themes to alert you to as we go through this material is that we not only have the ability to enhance the drugs that we've already been using in multiple myeloma, which is to say newer generations of the drugs that we heard before. We heard quite a bit already about the three critical drugs of thalidomide, bortezomib, and lenalidomide, but now to see even further generations of those drugs, but also now to see completely new ways of approaching this disease. And we think that's going to be fundamental on this path towards a cure that we're discussing tonight. So let me share with you that other angle of looking at things, what we might consider the up-and-coming drugs, the early-stage drugs, some of which are being used on their own or in combinations. So let's start with something called a monoclonal antibody. Monoclonal antibodies is a strategy of treatment that we're quite familiar with in other areas of hematology, in particular lymphoma. It's a bit of a paradox because antibodies are what are made by myeloma cells or made by plasma cells that sadly become cancerous, as Brian described to us earlier. The concept here is to be able to give a patient a drug that finds its way to the myeloma cell, hooks onto that myeloma cell, and in fact allows the body's own immune system to destroy it. So it's a bit like the concept of a smart bomb, of being able to find a drug that can find the bad cells and have your own body get rid of them, as opposed to giving, if you will, more generalized chemotherapy that might hit some of the bad cells but hit a lot of the good cells too. And I'll have the privilege tomorrow morning of discussing one of these antibodies that doesn't even have a name yet, but we call it SAR 650984, SAR for short. And SAR is a drug that is a monoclonal antibody directed against something that's on the surface of almost every myeloma cell, something called CD38. And we really have some very impressive data that we'll present tomorrow. Another complete different way of approaching myeloma is through this, what we call a KSP inhibitor. One of the things, unfortunately, about cancer cells in general is they find a way to be immortal. They taste, if you will, of the fountain of youth. They find a way to live despite the body's trying to get rid of them. And although living for a long time is something we want, it's not something we want out of our myeloma cells. And so this drug has really demonstrated some very interesting and promising results being used with dexamethasone, and one of the abstracts being presented tomorrow in combination with carfilzomib is showing to us how we can stop that pathway, that we can invoke a so-called death pathway into these myeloma cells instead of allowing them to live as they do. And there are lots of other drugs. I could spend your whole evening and bore you to sleep about all these different agents that we have, but another one that is just coming out with new information are a class of drugs called HDAC inhibitors, which is again now looking at some of the genes that we know allow myeloma cells to live for longer periods of time. And by interacting with those genes that influence the growth of the myeloma cell and the life cycle of the myeloma cell, we can definitely see promise. And one of the particular features of these drugs that are of benefit is that these are pills, these are oral agents that we're now showing promise both on their own and in combination. Now, I mentioned from the start that yes, it's great to come from a new angle, and we want to see new diverse drugs, but we also have now ways of delivering drugs that we know are already very effective, but in a way that's more convenient and in many respects more effective for patients. And the two that I'm going to briefly mention are oral proteasome inhibitors. We've already heard from some of the patients who've shared their experiences with us that we have a drug called bortezomib or Velcade, which is a drug that has really been a critical agent in treating patients with multiple myeloma. But up until recently, it was a drug that we gave either intravenously or subcutaneously into the skin. Now we have, within this class of drugs, two agents that are pills that are, again, demonstrating promise. One is called MLN 9708, also known as ixazomib. I don't make the names, right? I just report them to you. But ixazomib is a drug that we've now seen being used in newly diagnosed patients. We've seen it on its own, we've seen it in combination, we've seen it in maintenance therapy, and we've even seen it in relapse therapy. So ixazomib is something to keep on your radar screen. And the other drug, a little bit earlier on development, but I've had the privilege of leading some studies in this drug, is called oprozomib, which stands for the oral proteasome inhibitor, oprozomib. And this is also a drug that we use as a pill, and it's been demonstrating activity in multiple myeloma and even in a cousin disease, if you will, something known as Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. And finally, of these agents, the ones that we already have in the toolbox. So we have new mechanisms, we have newer versions of the drugs that we have, but we also have, as we heard being discussed, of what is going on in Canada and what we have now already in the United States. We have drugs already in our toolbox, but we want to be able to use them the best way we can. And that's I think one of the great lessons that we're learning this year at the American Society of Hematology annual meeting is that now, yes, these drugs are FDA approved, but we want to find the best way to use them on their own, to use them in combination. What sequence is the best sequence of these drugs so that we can provide benefit to our patients in the short term and in the long term to not only benefit their quantity of life, but their quality of life. And so with pomalidomide, we've seen how it can be used in combination, how it can be used on its own, how it's been used in the relapse setting, even in patients who have so-called high-risk disease. As we heard Brian say from the start, this is a disease that is highly variable. Some people, sadly, succumb to this disease within months to years. Others can live over 20 years with this condition. And so we divide people into different categories based on that, what we call risk status. And we've seen that pomalidomide has been able, as a drug that's been able to overcome some of those high-risk profiles. Carfilzomib, also known as Kyprolis, is another agent that's been very well profiled at this meeting. We're seeing more and more the ability to use this drug in newly diagnosed patients. So we can have this very effective, very rapidly functioning drug early on in the course of people's disease. We've also seen it in combination with other drugs, as you see on the screen here, such as Revlimid, such as Cytoxan, in multiple different settings. And then most perhaps interestingly is a presentation combining both of these drugs together. If we have two drugs that have really shown efficacy, have really shown that they can be well tolerated by the overwhelming majority of patients who take it, what of putting those two drugs together? And now we're doing the studies of pomalidomide and carfilzomib together and seeing response rates of over 2/3 of patients who have been very heavily pretreated with almost everything else we have available and still showing response. At this point, I want you to meet someone who I had the privilege recently of meeting. We share the joy of running marathons together. Don Wright, I'm going to ask Don to come up while we show a short video.
I had just started to run marathons, and I had, in fact, just run my first one. We had an inkling about the myeloma before I ran it, and then after I ran it, we got the test results back, and I thought, I want to qualify for Boston and go and run Boston. And when I did that, by then we had 3 states, and it just seemed reasonable to keep going.
Keep it up! Keep it up!
It's great to have you with us here, Don. There's many things that we could say about Don. Let me just give you a couple of comments before we ask him a few questions. Don has run 77 marathons. Yeah, thank you. I suspect that if we added all the marathons run by the rest of us in the room combined, that we'd not likely get to 77. Just saying, just saying. Now, as we like to say, the weather sadly did what myeloma could not do, and Don was not able to run the Memphis Marathon yesterday because of an ice storm. So we need ice to stop Don from running his marathons. But as you can see here from this photo, he's run marathons right across the country. He's in all 50 states. I understand your goal is to get to 100 marathons. Not 100 years old, but perhaps maybe 100 years old and 100 marathons. But Don, one of the things we wanted you to share with us tonight, just share with us a little bit of what it's been like, not only to run these marathons, of course, but to be able to live and do the things that you've wanted to do despite being on treatment.
Well, of course, the reason that I can do this, can travel and run marathons, is because of the kind of miraculous drug that I'm taking, pomalidomide, and it's it's just a little pill. I take it every night, and I don't need to go into clinics, and it to me is a perfect example of the kind of treatment that we're talking about now, a modern, innovative drug that, while I am not cancer-free, it makes me free from cancer in the sense that I don't have any effects from cancer.
That's great. I love to hear that I'm working myself out of a job. When you don't want to come to the clinic and don't have to come to the clinic, that's a good thing. Don, I'm very interested in your description of that you're not cancer-free, but you're free from cancer. Is that how you said it?
Yes.
I like the way you said it. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I don't have, there's nothing that holds me back. All of the drugs have side effects, and Pomalyst does too. But for me, the biggest effect makes me want to run a marathon. The only side effect that I have to deal with is the same that I would have if I had no treatment at all from the myeloma. I have to watch the white cell count, and we do that. That's the response to that issue, and we watch it, and that's all there is to it.
That's great to hear, Don. I think one of the things we want to be careful tonight is we want to make it sound that absolutely every patient that's treated with myeloma is a perfect success story. I mean, frankly, what drives me to do what I do every day is when I sadly see the patients of mine who suffer and the patients that we lose. I lost a patient the day I came to ASH this last week. It's challenging. On the other hand, if we're going to follow this path that we've laid out tonight of a path towards a cure, the first major step in that path is to convert this disease from being what we sometimes call incurable to chronic. And Don could be the poster boy, if I'm allowed to say that, of turning this into a chronic disease. It's there, but it's under control. We haven't cured high blood pressure. We haven't cured diabetes, but we can, in the majority of patients, control it over the long term. And pomalidomide and many of these other agents, and hopefully some of these new ones that we've referred to, are going to be able to do that. And in fact, I would suggest that it makes us even more aware of the importance of quality of life. Because it's one thing to see those curves get flatter and flatter, which is lovely, but it's another thing to make sure that as people are living longer, they're living well. And we appreciate what you represent, Don. We appreciate your commitment to myeloma and your commitment to being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to close in just a moment, but just in that vein, one of the curves that we wanted to show you here is one of the studies that was presented here at the American Society of Hematology annual meeting. I've talked about those curves, so-called flattening, as it were. We use commonly a regimen at Mayo Clinic, and really now used across the world, that we call Cyborg-D. I know it sounds like an alien, but it's a combination of 3 drugs: cyclophosphamide, bortezomib, also known as Velcade, and dexamethasone. And one of the features that we found with this is we can balance some of the old school chemotherapy and cyclophosphamide along with the newer school agents such as bortezomib, and together we find a great synergy between these drugs. And now we've been able to similarly use this combination in the context of carfilzomib and the context of lenalidomide. And this is just to show you here that overall survival curve, albeit not completely flat, is moving in that direction. And if you had said a decade ago that we're going to have a combination of drugs that are going to allow more than 2/3 of patients to live 5 years, we would have wondered if you were living in dreamland. And may I suggest when we hold this in another 5 years from now that curve hopefully will be even more flat. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much and let you know that the end is not when the American Society of Hematology meeting ends on Tuesday, that there are myeloma researchers across the world who are committed to this disease, and so many organizations like the one you're hearing from tonight, and hopefully with updated data, with updated trials, month after month, year after year, we'll achieve the goal that we're seeking. So thank you for your attention. Thanks, Brian.
So thank you so much, Joe, and to Dawn and to Varda, who came up with her emotional message. I would like to transition into another concept which will take up the balance of the program tonight, and that is that we are definitely focused on controlling the disease, turning it into a chronic disease if we can. And for myeloma, we went through so much time, decades literally, where we couldn't even use the word cure because we didn't want to talk about it. We're not close enough to even talk about it. But now, with the combinations of these novel agents, we're seeing very, very deep responses to treatment, and we're seeing longer survival. And I think that what you're going to hear from our next speaker, Dr. Mateos from Salamanca in Spain, is what happens if you start really early? What happens if you look to the future and start to treat smoldering myeloma? So I'd like you to welcome and listen carefully to Dr. Mateos from Salamanca in Spain.
So thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much to the International Myeloma Foundation for giving me the opportunity to share with you, the journalists, or the different audience, to the researchers that they are used to use the same type of results and combinations. So I think that the audience is very attractive, and I'm going to speak about another type of myeloma, one specific type of myeloma called smoldering multiple myeloma or asymptomatic myeloma. And what the name is asymptomatic myeloma? Brian already defined previously the myeloma as malignant plasma cells in which plasma cells proliferate into the bone marrow, and they produce a monoclonal component, a monoclonal protein that we can see in the serum protein electrophoresis. But most importantly, the symptomatic multiple myeloma is always associated to the presence of an organ damage. And the organ damage that he previously said consisted on the presence of bone disease, renal impairment, anemia, hypercalcemia. Now we are going to speak about asymptomatic myeloma. Patients with smoldering myeloma, with asymptomatic myeloma, have just plasma cell proliferation into the bone marrow, plus a monoclonal component that is visible in the serum protein electrophoresis, but no organ damage is present. Any symptomatology is present in patients with asymptomatic multiple myeloma. At the present time, this situation, you can imagine that represents a key point to plan an early treatment. So I think that the previous slide, or no? Yeah, so smoldering myeloma clear at the present time may represent a key point to plan an early intervention. But I think that also it's important to know that smoldering myeloma is an heterogeneous disease. I previously said that smoldering myeloma includes patients with asymptomatic myeloma, but not all smoldering myeloma are similar, because within the same definition of asymptomatic multiple myeloma, there are some patients who have very low risk of progression to symptomatic disease. There are patients with an intermediate risk of progression to symptomatic disease, but there are also patients at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease. And for this last subgroup of patients, the risk of progression is approximately 10% per year. So if we decided to plan an early treatment for smoldering myeloma patients, probably you agree with me that there is not many sense to plan an early treatment for patients in which the risk of progression to symptomatic disease is just 1% per year, because it is very low risk. And probably also it is not possible to plan an early treatment for patients at intermediate risk of progression. However, the group of patients at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease, 10% per year, probably this group of patients is the group of patients in which we can focus to plan an early treatment. And the first point to plan an early treatment in this group of patients is to consider the definition of smoldering. And in fact, International Myeloma Foundation with other researchers around the world are working in this changing. Probably smoldering myeloma should be revisited because there are many different types of disease under the definition of smoldering myeloma patients. And the most important thing is that probably high-risk smoldering myeloma should be considered as a different entity. Even within the high-risk group of smoldering myeloma patients, we can identify ultra-high risk, so patients who will progress very, very soon after the diagnosis. But the focus of the presentation tonight is patients at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease. And you can ask me how we can identify patients at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease. It's relatively easy because now at the present time we have many different prognostic factors predicting progression to symptomatic disease. And I previously said that asymptomatic myeloma patients have a monoclonal component and plasma cell bone marrow infiltration. Mayo Clinic Group defined many years ago that when the monoclonal component is higher than 3 grams and the plasma cell bone marrow infiltration is higher than 10%, those patients will progress with a risk of 50% in the next 2 years. Our group in Salamanca also identified the same high-risk group of patients using another different technology, flow cytometry. Other groups have incorporated serum-free light chain or even imaging assessment. The final message is that it is relatively easy to identify high-risk smoldering myeloma patients, that we know that they will progress with a 50% of probability in the next 2 years. And so if it is relatively easy to identify this high-risk group of patients, why not to plan an early treatment for this group of patients, for patients with smoldering myeloma? In the past, you have to know that different trials evaluated the role of early treatment in smoldering myeloma patients in asymptomatic myeloma patients, but they didn't obtain any benefit. Do you know what was the reason? Because trials conducted in the past included patients at low risk, patients at intermediate risk, and also patients at high risk. So probably patients at high risk may obtain a benefit, but there is not any benefit for patients at low risk of progression to symptomatic disease. And this was the reason why the Spanish myeloma group decided to conduct a trial in smoldering myeloma patients, in patients with asymptomatic disease, but at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease. So we decided to select high-risk smoldering myeloma patients and to early treat them. So we were thinking about the optimal therapy for this group of asymptomatic myeloma patients. And I think that it is very clear to understand that we have to choose probably an oral drugs, because it's important to remind that these patients were asymptomatic. Also, a drug effective in myeloma, and if possible, of course, well tolerated. because, again, the standard of care for this group of patients is not treatment. So for this reason, we choose lenalidomide plus low-dose dexamethasone, because this combination at the moment of the design of this trial had demonstrated to be effective in myeloma patients at the moment of relapse or disease progression. To conduct this trial, I repeat early treatment in high-risk smoldering myeloma patients. We included 125 patients, and they were randomized to receive early treatment or no treatment, because abstention, therapeutic abstention, was the standard of care for this group of patients. The first important finding was that lenalidomide plus low-dose dex was really effective in patients with asymptomatic multiple myeloma. And in fact, the overall response rate was 80%, with 16% of complete remission rate after 9 induction cycles, indicating that this combination was as effective as in symptomatic multiple myeloma. But of course, the primary endpoint of this trial was to try to demonstrate that the early treatment in high-risk smoldering myeloma patients was able to delay the time to progression to symptomatic disease. In other words, to delay the time to progression to develop a renal impairment, bone lesions, hypercalcemia, or anemia. And these curves represent a clear benefit for the early treatment with lenalidomide plus low-dose dexamethasone. In the yellow curve, you can see the median, the curve representing the number of patients who progressed under early treatment with Lendex. And you can see that few patients have already progressed under early treatment. By contrast, if you look at the blue curve representing the patients who didn't receive any treatment, you can see that at the moment of last follow-up, 75% of the patients had already progressed, indicating that early treatment is of clear benefit for high-risk smoldering myeloma patients. But probably the most important finding is that the benefit in response rate and in time to progression to symptomatic disease translated into a significant benefit in terms of overall survival. And again, the yellow curve represented the survival of patients who received early treatment with lenalidomide plus dexamethasone, and the benefit is clearly evident. In fact, at 5 years, 94% of the patients who received early treatment were alive, while 78% of the patients who didn't receive any treatment were alive at 5 years. Also, another important point to evaluate in this trial was toxicity profile. I repeat again, we were dealing with patients in which the standard of care was not treatment. So we had to demonstrate that the early treatment was well tolerated. And this was really demonstrated because we evaluated the different toxicity profile, hematological toxicity and non-hematological toxicity in different grades, grades 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in this trial, most of the patients developed grade 1 and grade 2 adverse events, indicating that the treatment was very well tolerated. But just to note in this slide, the line represented infections. Infections were observed in approximately 35–40% of the patients who received lenalidomide plus low-dose dex. So you can tell me, oh, it's a high frequency of infection in this type of patients, even no severe infections. But look at the line representing the frequency of infections, but in patients who didn't receive any treatment, 26%, indicating that toxicity profile was similar in the abstention arm and in the treatment arm. So our final conclusion is that clearly this early treatment was very well tolerated by the patients because patients had a very good physical conditions and they were able to continue in their daily activities. So the conclusions about this trial evaluating the role of early treatment in a high-risk smoldering myeloma patient is that smoldering myeloma, I repeat, should be revisited the definition. And all smoldering myeloma patients should be stratified at the moment of diagnosis to distinguish if the patient is at a low risk, intermediate risk, or high risk. And the most important reason is that because I consider that high risk and ultra high risk smoldering myeloma patients can obtain a significant benefit if they receive an early treatment before the disease developed any symptomatology such as bone disease, renal impairment, anemia, or hypercalcemia. You have also to know that there are many clinical trials ongoing evaluating the role of early treatment in high-risk smoldering myeloma patients, with many of the novel agents that Dr. Mikhael previously presented in his presentation, with proteasome inhibitors, other immunomodulatory drugs, because the final objective would be to try to cure some patients with high-risk smoldering myeloma patients. We wanted to apply to high-risk smoldering myeloma patients the same therapeutic approach that oncologists are doing with the solid tumors. Not to wait to disease develop any symptomatology and to early treat before when patients are at high risk of progression to symptomatic disease. And I think all these results clearly support to change the current treatment paradigm for this patient population, and probably we can call about early treatment in early myeloma patients. And I think that I don't have any more slides, just to thank to the Spanish myeloma group and to all investigators and patients, especially patients who participate in this trial, showing a significant benefit from the early treatment in this group of patients. And thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Maria V, for this really pioneering study. This was a very brave study without knowledge of what would be the outcome. But now, in scientific terms, this gives us what we would call proof of principle. Proof of principle that early treatment like this can improve the survival, and also gives us confidence, and has given the Spanish team confidence to look at a more aggressive approach with the idea of potentially starting to cure patients with myeloma. And so this brings us to the last point that we want to talk about tonight, and that is where are we in moving this concept forward? What are the future directions to move from chronic, which we're clearly achieving in a number of patients whom you've met tonight, towards looking to try to say that we can cure some patients with myeloma. And so there is an initiative that has just begun from the International Myeloma Foundation called the Black Swan Research Initiative. And right at the beginning of this ASH meeting, we had an investigator meeting, including the team from Spain, to discuss aspects of this, to come up with the structure and the framework to have trials to really attempt to cure patients with what you've heard described as high-risk smoldering myeloma, patients at a high risk of developing myeloma within the next 2 years. And so this is a collaborative approach with the clear objective of trying to find a curative regimen for myeloma. To do this, we need to go beyond the Revlimid and Dex, which gave us the proof of the principle, and come up with novel combinations that really can knock myeloma down to a low level, to a level that we call minimal residual disease, so very little myeloma left, and minimal residual disease 0, MRD 0, where there is 0 disease left. And so to accomplish this, we need to consider the treatment with the right patient. As Maria V said, we need to look at the risk category. We need to consider the treatment at the right time, and in this case, early on, and measuring all the way along what we're accomplishing to make sure that we are continuing to knock the residual disease down to the lowest possible level. And so this provides, as I've said in the slide here, a standardized framework to attempt to achieve cure. And so to cure myeloma, we need to get rid of the myeloma or to prevent the development of clones which are resisting the treatment. We need to come up with the combinations that can do the job, and we need to be able to track what we're doing. So these are the components of this sort of a strategy. And so to summarize the idea of treating myeloma and preventing or getting rid of the resistant clones, the therapy that might work early would be the combination that could work in the later stages of the disease. And there's another concept about myeloma that we've learned about also from the team at the Mayo Clinic, where we've started to understand that clones or subclones develop when you give treatment. Some of the myelomas left, what we call subclones. And as you move around the circle that you see in front of me, there is a tiny, tiny subclone illustrated in this particular slide in blue. And you can see that at the beginning, there's a very tiny amount of blue, but ultimately, the cells which are sensitive to the treatment have been wiped out, and you're left with a lot of blue. And the blue is the clones or subclones which are resistant to the treatment. And so to get rid of them, it's very challenging at the later stage where these cells are taking over. The chance we have to get rid of them is to get rid of that little bit of blue right at the beginning. And so this is the strategy. Develop the regimens that can get rid of the blue and give it early. And so to know that we're doing a good job, we need to have trust in the tests that we're using. If you knock the myeloma down, is the testing really sensitive enough to make sure that there's no myeloma left? And so one way to be having a degree of confidence about that is to look at previous therapies, to look at what we've experienced in the last 20 to 30 years. And we are fortunate through our International Myeloma Working Group to have patients who are doing well, some patients with transplant, especially a type of transplant called allotransplant, who are alive 10 and 20, even 30 years later. And we can see in those patients, we have samples that have been banked and saved, frozen and saved, and we can study the sensitivity of our testing to see if the test results correlate with the outcome in these patients that have been living and doing well with myeloma for 20 and 30 years in the past. And so once we're confident with those tests, we can apply them looking forward and see if they can give us good guidance to improve and get the best therapy moving forward. And so this is the strategy, to define the cure and then to implement the therapy to achieve cure. And so we're not megalomaniacs. We are thinking that initially, as you can see in the red here, we're thinking that there will be a fraction of patients where we might be successful in the short term. In the next few years, you can see that we're hoping that the good risk patients with a very small amount of blue, maybe if we start early, we can really get rid of the blue. But we're realistic to think that with the green and the blue arrows there, that there will be other patients where it's definitely going to be more challenging. We're going to have to come up with different combinations of the novel agents that you heard from Joe Mikhael, and that over time, we will have a chance to eradicate the myeloma for those patients too. But I think, and I hope that you can see this point, that the very, very encouraging point here is that we are able to discuss the idea that we're attempting to cure myeloma in a framework that's not unrealistic, in a framework where there is hope that we will start to be doing this in the near term and work on this and improve the percentages over time. And so we have started this Black Swan project and it really kicked into high gear after discussions actually between myself and Susie that we can talk about later perhaps. But in the short term, we had this idea. And you'll notice here that the Black Swan is positioned on the left in the middle of the balancing rocks. And as we move forward, we realize that we need lots of ideas related to this, and so that we need to have lots of new and baby swans. And it's interesting that black swans, when they have babies, they're actually white swans, so we don't mention that a lot. But we are anxious that the swan will actually move and get a more prominent position on the rocks as we start to cure patients with myeloma. So I would like to stop there, and in the hope that you have learned a lot and that we've given you this sense of hope that we all bring from this meeting. We're learning a lot and learning about things that will move the outcomes for myeloma patients forward. So please join me in thanking our panel. And we will welcome questions for you in the room or for these various people over here who seem to have been tweeting pretty furiously. I can't read anything from here, though.
Any questions from the journalists?
Yes, so starting in the audience, yes, this gentleman in the second row. Do you need a microphone, perhaps? And he's lost his voice. Okay, so...
What's the next big headline we can hope to hear in this progression of advances? What's the headline that we hope to hear, let's say, in the next 2 years?
All right, so what is the headline that we expect to hear in the next 2 years? So maybe I can bring this to my friends and colleagues here. So maybe Joe or Maria V, what?
I can ask you, I can answer with a provocative answer, because I have presented the results of our trial conducted in high-risk smoldering myeloma patients. Our next step is to plan a more aggressive therapy for this high-risk subgroup of smoldering myeloma patients. Why? Because we think that if we add probably a third drug to lenalidomide plus low-dose dex, such as a proteasome inhibitor, and if we plan a more extended therapy for this high-risk group of patients, our hypothesis, according to the Black Swan project, our hypothesis is that 50% of the patients will be in immunophenotypic complete remission, so with a minimal residual disease 0 at 5 years. So we hope that hypothetically a subset of these patients will be cured. So this is my perspective, more ambitious.
So mark that down, 50%. So Joe, what you can comment on that, and you can make a comment of your own.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's great. I think what we've just heard Dr. Mateos express is very a legitimate approach, and very much in keeping with what we want to see. Of course, I'm never content with 50% in 5 years. I want more. We're always going to want more. You know, I think everybody wants that sort of catchy headline, but I think if we look at the history of the last 20, if not 50 years of myeloma, it's always been incremental baby steps forward with intervening larger steps forward. And it's like I get asked in the lay press all the time with my role at ASH, you know, when are we going to find the cure for cancer? Well, you're not going to open a newspaper tomorrow and find it. But we're going to take a series of steps forward. And I think the sheer number of abstracts that were being presented this meeting, I think the sheer number of drugs that are on their own showing activity. You know, it's not just a question of getting one more drug. When you add one more drug, you're adding literally a dozen more combinations that are potential with that drug. Now, if we think we have, you know, in the ballpark of 10 active single agent drugs in myeloma. So how do I make that into a nice tagline for you? You know, I mean, it's a burden of proof against myeloma that we're looking for, that I think these steps that we've made forward from the bench of understanding the disease, from defining better ultra high risk or high risk smoldering myeloma, right through to now using drugs that are specifically targeted in that realm. Because although we made this huge advance with the three major drugs, thalidomide, Velcade, and Revlimid, and their new equivalents, there's only so far those drugs are going to take us. So my look to the future is to say we're now approaching this disease at many different angles in many different ways, and that's how we're going to take down the house. I'll leave you with one analogy that I often share with my patients. I say, myeloma is like trying to break into a house, right? And we keep going through the front door when we use a certain kind of drug, like a proteasome inhibitor or an IMiD drug like Revlimid. But eventually the house figures it out and it locks the front door. So you say, all right, I'll go through the back door. So you find a different path, you go through the back door, and eventually the house figures it out, it shuts the back door. And then you do the side door, then you do the other side door, and eventually it seems like there's no way of getting in. So we want to discover our other trap doors and other windows to get within that building. And I think that's what we've seen at this meeting, is that now, yes, we've found better ways to get in through that front door, but eventually that front door is going to be locked. And now we have different ways of getting into the building.
Very good. Another question here on my left, and then we have a couple of questions from Twitter or the cloud somewhere. I have them here.
Okay, Roberto Souza from Brazil at Magazine Emo in Revista. Unfortunately, in my country, the regulatory agency facing physicians and patient associations not approved new drugs yet. But my question is to Dr. Maria Mateos. Why different from lymphoma patient, for example, why this myeloma patient needs frequently many combination of the drugs?
What your question is, why did the patients need a combination of the different drugs?
Yeah.
As opposed to like a one drug?
Just two drugs, one drug versus two drugs versus three drugs is your question?
Exactly.
Yeah, because there are two drug combination, three drug combination, four drug combinations in multiple myeloma. So the first step when one new drug is investigated is to start about the simple combinations, even a single agent, to demonstrate that the drug is effective. But of course, behind the clinical activity of the drugs, there is many investigational preclinical research, and some preclinical studies usually showed that when you put together different agents with different mechanisms of action, they can have a synergistic effect. So next step is to translate it to the clinical activity these new combinations. And for example, for newly diagnosed myeloma patients, we know now that a three-drug combination is better than a two-drug combinations. And most of the newly diagnosed myeloma patients usually received a proteasome inhibitor plus IMiD. Why? Because preclinical studies have demonstrated that the combination of both drugs have a synergistic effect. So the effect is potentiated, and patients are going to obtain more benefit when they receive a three-drug versus two-drug combination. And this is the rationale for the combination of the different agents. But of course, it is possible also to use just a two-drug combination. And for example, in Europe, it's very common to use lenalidomide plus low-dose dexamethasone at the moment of relapse or disease progression. In Europe, it is not possible to use lenalidomide in the upfront setting. We reserve it at the moment of relapse or disease progression, and it is very common to use just lenalidomide plus low-dose dex without a third drug.
So perhaps I can follow up on this point. I have a question from the Twitter, which is, you mentioned the value of the Rev and the low-dose dex in the relapse setting. Today we heard the Rev and the dex in the frontline setting.
Of course.
And so the question is this data that we heard today, is this sufficient for us to consider this use? The question is, ready to be used worldwide is the question. Is this strong enough data for us to take this and say, okay, we apply this?
Definitely. I think that it is the largest trial, the largest randomized trial, the first trial conducted in elderly patients with multiple myeloma. And lenalidomide plus low-dose dex until disease progression showed a significant benefit in terms of progression-free survival and overall survival as compared with melphalan and proteasome plus thalidomide, a previous standard of care used for this group of patients. Of course, I think that this trial clearly supported that from today, probably we have a new standard of care for this patient population, but also a new backbone to which other novel agents can be added. But definitely, I agree.
Okay, and so we have actually a final question. I guess we're running close to the end of our program for Joseph Terman. And so the question for you is that you said that right now we have many choices. And so from your perspective, so what's the take-home message here? Well, we have all these choices, so what does this mean?
It means that the clinician must consider the patient's perspective, because when you don't have a single best treatment, I think that the patient has a voice, because ultimately they're the one that's going to deal with the side effects.
All right. Yes, and so this is the reason that I have the balanced rocks at the end of my talk, is that there's a balance between efficacy and side effects, and there needs to be a discussion to find out what's best for each individual patient. But the good news is that what's best is getting better and better, and so we hope that you've received that message loud and clear this evening. So thank you once again to our panel. Thank you for being here.